Hello, guys, and welcome to today's episode of the Master Your Mental podcast. As you guys can see, based on the title of this episode, Just Grow Podcast, we are going to be diving into the story, mission, and vision behind an awesome podcast called Just Grow. I am bringing on the creator of the podcast, Nick here, who's going to be not only sharing his inspirational story surrounding the birth of the podcast, but also the unique way in which the podcast is changing lives. Nick is a fellow entrepreneur with extensive experience in the field of marketing, photography, videography, and travel. So, without further ado, welcome Nick to the podcast.
That was an amazing intro. I appreciate that. Well received, or fully received, I should say.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. And I'm so excited because you guys, before this episode right here, Nick and I hopped on a call. We were just chatting, kind of like brainstorming, like, what do we want to talk about? What do you want to bring to the table? What kind of concepts are we going to get into? And he told me a little bit about his story and just some of the background here. But I'm super excited for you guys to get into this today. So before we go ahead and just dive on into this one, just tell us some more about you and what lights you up.
Great question. First of all, I read a book recently called The Values Factor by John D. Martini. I don't know if you've studied any of his work.
I haven't.
Would strongly recommend. But it's a book that really talks about how if you want to live the most fulfilled life that you possibly can, you want to be living through your highest values. And so I think I always, to a degree, kind of like had this nebulous idea of like what my values were, but I didn't know for certain. And so the reason I share all that is because I went through that book and it really solidified that my top three values is communication, relationships, and growth. And so that's just, it makes so much sense why the podcast is resonating with me. And I'm just love it so much is because I'm living through my values doing this podcast, all surrounded about growth.
Wow. That's so cool how the book was like helpful for you to tapping into identifying those values. Cause just like you said right there, I feel like so many people can relate to that. Like we all have this, general idea of like, okay, this is what's important to me. This is what I value. Here's what it is. But to really dive deeper into that and to see also like how that connects with the passion you have for the podcast and the mission you really have behind it. So I would love to get into that, you guys, because this is, I'm not going to say what it is because Nick will tell you, I don't want to give away what's going on with the podcast. He will tell you all about it. But yeah, so like I was saying, you do something very cool and something I've actually never seen done before with other podcasts, you guys. He hosts these live viewings where he records the intimate conversation with his guests with a live audience who's there watching, listening, tuning in, and giving their reaction and their responses. So I would love for you, Nick, to talk about the impact of doing this. Like, how did you come up with this? What has the impact been so far? And what effect has this had on people?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think I kind of pulled it from a few different pieces. The first place where I kind of like it sparked the idea was randomly I got invited to a podcast viewing. It was a much more small, intimate, and it was actually with a big influencer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Russell Brunson or not.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That's cool. So you went to the podcast viewing and you were like, wow.
Yeah. And it was another kind of like side crazy story about it is that in our agency, he got referred to us on that Tuesday. And then on a Friday, I got invited to this podcast viewing. So it was just like, I don't know, one of those things that you're like, how does this even make sense?
Wow.
And so he ended up becoming a client, but so that was cool. Like I got to meet him in person and now we're working with him. But like, I think that's where the idea was spawned. And then, so that was just kind of like sitting in my head somewhere, and then just had been going through some challenges. And I felt that anytime that I have a deep, meaningful conversation, it's therapeutic for me. I even was thinking about last time we got on a call afterwards, I was just like, that was just really enjoyable. And it kind of like, it really fed my soul. And I think about that every time I have a great conversation. That's the feeling I get from it. And I was like, well, maybe you should listen to this instead of like resisting it and just say like, actually do this. So I had been pondering on this for a little while. Then I went out to Utah for about a week and I was just doing a solo trip, kind of just exploring myself and maybe doing a little psychedelics as well. And so I'm on top of Angel's Landing in Zion Mountain, or in Zion National Park. And I'm up there and I had this great conversation with this guy all the way up to the top. He's an optometrist from South Africa. Just really cool, unique perspective on somebody I don't necessarily relate to someone like that before, but it was just so cool to just hear someone else's perspective. And he said something to me. He said, Nick, you ask really good questions. And that was the last thing I needed to hear to be like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing this. Cause I've been thinking about it for a while. And I was like, I just needed some clarity on top of the mountain from some South African guy to, to just inspire me to really take action. So I was up there and I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this. But then my next question was, how do I make this cool? How do I make this unique? How do I really get people engaged in this? Because I know we're not strangers to the fact that there's so many podcasts out there. I
Mm-hmm.
think I even heard something the other day. It was like, there's like 1.7 million podcasts or something like that.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
like, so it's like, how do you separate yourself? Like as a
Mm-hmm.
marketer, I'm always thinking like, how do I make myself different? And
Mm-hmm.
so I kind of been toying with this idea and it just kind of like popped in my mind. And then I was like, all right, well, it's actually my birthday in a week. Like maybe I could throw a podcast launch / birthday party. And I was like, this is kind of a crazy idea. And so I called up my friend, actually got a hold of him on Tuesday because he was away on travel and whatnot. And so I said, do you think this sounds like a good idea? Is this crazy? Like, is anybody going to show up? He's like, I think it sounds amazing. So I shot out a few DMs and sure enough, a bunch of people showed up. There was probably about 70 people at the first party. People seemed to like it. And it was honestly, talking about feeding my soul, that was probably one of the best nights of my life up until that point, just because I've always wanted to speak. And this was kind of like this backwards way of becoming a speaker. And so we did another one. My business partner was in town from the UK. I wanted to show him a good time. So we packed the venue out. It was like 125 at that one. And then we really promoted this last one and got around 225 people there. And it's just like, it just keeps on growing. And I think at this last one, it just became solidified in my mind. And I think a lot of other people's minds that this is something real. And it's not just like a little idea anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's like really becoming a thing. And it just, yeah, I think again, just continuing on this thread of it just really feeds my soul and aligns with my values. So yeah, I think it's just a perfect match, something I've
That's
been trying to find my
so
whole life.
Oh my gosh. Okay. That's what I think is so cool about that when you keep saying feeding my soul. Cause I'm always trying to find this connection, like out here on this podcast, mental health and mindset, right, are the biggest things. And when you talk about that, and you guys, I actually was at his last event. That's where we met. That's where we connected because I went because one of my friends was like, hey, I'm going to this really cool thing. Like you should definitely, stop by, come with me. And I was like, yes. I was like, what is it? And she told me podcast party live. And I was like, this is so cool. I was like, of course I'm going to go. And I went and I sat there and I listened to this conversation that Nick was having with Dylan. And it was such a conversation and an episode, especially that I've never seen before or been a part of because it was so engaging. And that was the thing that I was like, really blown away by how you were asking, having this conversation with Dylan, and then you guys were going back and forth and bringing up amazing value and tips and tricks from his story and his experiences, but also engaging the audience and things that you usually think, okay, these are topics that might be, intimate or like hard for people to like really feel comfortable diving into, but you did it in a way that was so beautiful and so raw, engaging, and like just really brought the energy in the entire room together. And especially to share things like, that I talk about a lot on this podcast, people come on and share their experiences, their story, having gone through, sexual abuse, sexual trauma, any kind of trauma in their life in some form and capacity, and sharing that story and sharing that moment, these experiences and the lessons that they pulled from that. I thought was so, so cool just to be a part of that. And that's when I was like, you know what, like, I really want you to come on here and share your story about yourself, but also the podcast, because, you guys, I'm going to link it in the show notes for you. It's, I said it like, a couple times and I'm going to keep saying it again. It's Just Grow podcast, available where you get your podcast, but you should definitely tune in. There is so much value there in these interviews and conversations. And another question I really want to ask you is about the impact that we kind of got into a little bit. But what impact do you hope that the Just Grow podcast will have on listeners and on yourself in the long run?
The biggest impact that I want to make is for people to be honest with themselves. So therefore they can be honest with everybody around them. It's interesting because they talk about how, if you have a weakness how if you really identify that and become aware of it, it actually can become one of your biggest strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the longest time, I was kind of raised to not necessarily like directly taught from my parents, but maybe just kind of observe them kind of avoiding, not necessarily avoiding, but not having those tough conversations. And so I got really good at telling 90% truths. And
Mm-hmm.
if something's tough to bring up, I usually was like, I'm good. Everything's fine, even if
Mm-hmm.
I'm not fine. And so recently I kind of discovered that my superpower is vulnerability and sharing with other people, because it gives other people permission to open up themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the biggest things with this podcast, because this also, the idea of a podcast really spawned from when I went through a pretty wild injury. I tore my pectoral tendon in the gym. All things were just going haywire in my life. And that's kind of like, I almost had like a spiritual awakening, I would say, from this. And then I was never really into podcasting. I really wasn't. And then all of a sudden, like one of my favorite musical artists started a podcast, and I started listening to it, and it helped me so much. And probably the biggest thing that I pulled from that is that it made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. I think in the entrepreneurial realm, a lot of people feel like they're alone. I know I certainly did. And when I hear these amazing like celebrities, athletes talking about these challenges that they have, and I'm like, oh, I can relate to that. And so I think ever since I started listening to that, I was like, I've always wanted to be an inspiration. I didn't know exactly what that looked like. I thought it was going to be, I was going to have this amazing success story of becoming this massive entrepreneur, making a lot of money and doing all of this, and then like inspiring people to do the same thing. And that's certainly still a strong goal of mine. But it's interesting because I feel the thing that I resisted for the most in my life, of this vulnerability and having honest, tough conversations, it became my superpower, and actually is the thing that has helped the most people. So it's kind of crazy
Wow.
how things kind of come full circle like
Yeah,
that.
especially how you talk about, in the beginning for you, like this was the one of the most difficult and challenging things for you. And the fact that you're bringing this out, not only of yourself, but also the guests and also the people interacting who are at these live events, of that aspect of honesty and being able to be honest with yourself and start having these conversations and engaging more with this, and like the steps of how to even do that, because I feel like so many people, may have been in the audience and may have never thought, like you said, keeping these things to ourselves, or being raised in a way where these conversations really aren't had, or they're like, no one really knows, the right time. Like, how do I start this? Like, what should I say? So it really goes unsaid and it just remains in that person. So for you to bring this out in such a way that really does help people, I think is incredibly impactful, because that person, probably is at your event and they leave and they say, because I was here, I feel like I'm able to do this now. Like, I feel like I'm able to pick up the phone and, talk to my mom, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my friend, coworker, whoever, and get into this thing that they feel like they never could have before or never would have been able to. And I feel like that is such a special thing and a special gift, because so many people are probably searching for that. And they're, like reading books, trying to like gather information and consume information, to find out, how to do these things and like how to embark on this and like do it the right way. But I think it's so natural, like in a conversation, like you said, like in a podcast. And the fact that you really, weren't as into this before. And then you got into it because you had a friend, musician, who started his podcast, and then you took so much away from that. And you were like, why don't I create something in my own way in a similar kind of fashion that can help people on this level? So, I really think that's a huge thing, because, with anything, surrounding these topics of mental health, which I'm so huge on, and so in like passionate about this field and all of it. I love when I see other people out there, who also share that passion and want to bring it to life for other people. So I'd love to ask you, if you can get into, talk to me about, some of the work that you've personally done yourself to pour into your mindset and your mental health to really be able to make that a priority.
Yeah, great question. I've been an entrepreneur, and I would say like a growth minded individual for a long time. When I was 18, my mom gave me a copy of The Secret.
Wow.
And that's kind of what's, I would say, just like kickstarted everything. By no means was it like she gave me The Secret and all of a sudden I was attracting Ferraris in my driveway,
Mm-hmm.
that year or anything like, but it just like, it planted the idea. And I'm so grateful for my mom, because she's always been the one to really pushed me in the direction of personal development and growing. But it was interesting because I've always been on this kick of like staying positive and visualizing and affirmations and all those type of things, reading books and just learning and growing like that. But I think there's kind of two sides to growth, in my opinion. And I think growth can look different for everybody at different stages of their life. But I think there's kind of the light side and then the dark side, or if you want to call it shadow work, as far as I'm concerned. And I, again, kind of avoided that shadow work because I always thought, like, well, why focus on the negatives? Why focus on the past? Why focus on things that aren't necessarily serving me? Why don't I just move forward?
Mm-hmm.
And so that, again, kind of came from the place of like where I stayed. But I just, there's a lot to the story, but I think something that kind of kickstarted is my grandma, who we called Yaya. She passed away last March. And
Mm.
so I think on top of when I had my injury, and that kind of was a spiritual awakening, and that was like right after I did psychedelics for the first time, I think it all
Mm-hmm.
kind of like that was very connected. I had a big transformation in terms of like the light version. But
Mm-hmm.
then once my yaya passed, I don't know, something kind of shifted in me. And it was really unique because I started recognizing how I can really sense energy a lot, and it just started getting more apparent. And
Mm-hmm.
it was crazy because I won't go too depth of the story because it's kind of a long story, but we ended up getting to say goodbye to my yaya, and we didn't know if that was going to be the case because we flew back to Colorado. She was declining at a very quick rate. I wrote a letter to her on the airplane, and I didn't know if I was going to be able to read it to her, but I figured it would be good for me. And I was just like bawling the whole time. My
Mm-hmm.
neighbor was probably just wondering what the heck is going on with this guy.
Oh.
Turns out we did get there in time. Um, and I did read it to her. I was surprised I could even make it through the whole thing. It took me a few times to like actually
Mm-hmm.
start it, stop it, and just because it was very emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And said it to her. We stood by the bedside for a little bit longer. Then she was having some complications. We got out of the room. We were hanging out in the living room, and all of a sudden, I don't know how I even felt it or anything, but like I felt her leave when
Wow.
she passed. And I don't know, that something just like really opened up in me in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
and months down the road too. And then that kind of led me to just being a little bit more intuitive. Also, an ex-girlfriend really helped me start being a lot more honest and vulnerable, which I'm so grateful for. And she was just like a big impact for me to step into that power. So all that to say, it led me to making a decision to go to this emotional intelligence leadership program.
Oh, wow. What is it
And
called? Where was it? Or what is it called?
it's in Las Vegas. It's called Choice Center.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a crazy story in itself. Like I mentioned to my buddy who's been mentioning it to me. I told him like I might be interested in this, and he's like, "Wow, that's crazy. I've been telling you about this for a year, and now you're just telling me." And so he's like, "All right, look at the schedule, see when the next one is, because they do it every like I want to say like 6 to 8 weeks." It was on Thursday when we talked on Tuesday, and so I made the quick decision after he like definitely pushed me to do it. And then I drove on a Wednesday. I drove on Thursday to Vegas, and then I was really nervous because I knew this was kind of like the shadow work. This was the
Mm-hmm.
dark work. This is the time to be open, honest, and vulnerable. And one of the biggest things is I knew I had some sexual trauma that I didn't want to admit for ever. I kept it in for
Mm-hmm.
22 years. I didn't think I was going to tell a single soul. And something just spoke to me to do it. I shared it with one girl. We were doing a dyad, and then that felt so amazing, like this elation that I've
Mm-hmm.
never experienced before. And I thought I was done. I thought it was just like, all right, one and done. I'm good. That's all
Mm-hmm.
I need. But then I ended up sharing it with our little power group, which was like 6 people. One of the people in that group like came up to me and was like, "Thank you so much for sharing. That allowed me to open up and share about this, which helped me out so much." And then I was like, wow, like that helped people. And so I ended up sharing it with the whole class. Then I started sharing with some friends. I thought I was going to be done there, but then I ended up starting sharing it with my close family members. My sister, my parents was the toughest one.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably the biggest challenge. But yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, long story short, to answer your question is going through that program and finding a safe space to really open up that made all the difference. And then just seeing how much it impacted people in a positive way, that just opened up my eyes. And so kind of started realizing that the more I share, the more I give people permission to do the same thing, the more it's helping them. So it's like, I've always wanted to really help people. So this was a great opportunity to do it.
Wow. And one of the things that really, hearing you just say all of that, that just resonates so much is the fact that, when we talk about, how to prioritize our mental health, right? And how to make this a priority, going and tackling the thing that is, like you said, the shadow work, the hard stuff to really get into and like do that and get into that emotional work and start to do that process. But when you do that, I've never met anyone yet who's told me that, in the process of doing this work, that the outcome of it was regret. I wish I didn't do that. I wish I didn't share these things, because usually what I hear and see is, people get into this and they share this stuff and other people are so impacted. Like you said, people coming up to you and saying, thank you so much for sharing this part of your story and sharing this experience, because this is helping me be able to open up about this thing. And it's almost like this cascading, like spiral effect of, because you were willing to do that. And obviously it was not easy. It's not like you snap your fingers and you're like, all right, cool. Like I can just, get into the story and just share this like right here in this moment. It isn't always like that. And it's different for everybody. But the fact that you were able to do that and, to bring that to other people so that they can continue to do that work, I think is one of the most helpful things for our mental health is to, because like usually, at least in what I've seen in conversations with, all my awesome guests here is, they have something that happened, whether it be a certain trauma that is continuing to cause pain and suffering in some ways that they're not always aware of in their life. And I love how you bring up, being grateful and thankful for, the relationships that you've had in the past, like, and things that you've engaged with, right? Like you said, bringing up, being able to be more honest and more vulnerable from an ex-girlfriend of yours and being able to really tap into that through having that connection. That's what I love, because I feel like even in situations that are difficult and are challenging and are very stressful and overwhelming and very hard to handle and be in, we have these lessons and these things that we can pull out from that and, really help us see like, wow, like I can do this and I can move forward from this and I can get into these conversations because like you said, for 22 years, like you were talking about, 22 years of, not thinking that you ever could do that you ever were going to be able to do that and having that and then being able to do that, like you said, like having that feeling of freedom and, being able to know like what I'm doing and what I'm saying, isn't just, to get it out there. It's to help other people do the same. And that's what I think is so, beautiful. It just really resonates with me when you were talking about all of that. And, one of the last things I want to ask you here is I always love this question because everyone gives me a different response, but it's always so helpful and so valuable here. So I'd love to ask you, Nick, what are you currently doing right now in this moment to master your mental?
I would say probably the best thing that I'm doing is having conversations like these. As I mentioned before, is the podcast, these conversations, these deep conversations, they're very therapeutic for me. And
Mhm.
it's like it's it's really interesting dichotomy. I feel that like once you open this up, it's like you understand yourself more, but in the same note, you kind of like you're challenged more. So it's
Mhm.
kind of like this interesting duality. And I even catch myself still like having rough days and just being like kind of a little anxious. But I know that anytime I'm able to have a deep, meaningful conversation, it helps out significantly. Like even today, I went out, grabbed a coffee with a good buddy of mine, and it was just we just talked about some really cool stuff and some some interesting ideas and really deep. So again, at the end of the day, the reason I started this podcast was kind of selfish. I just wanted to like have cool conversations with people, with awesome people, and the people listening and the big crowds. That's a bonus for sure. But you know,
Yes. And I love like how the statement too, when you guys check out the podcast, you'll see this, like you talk about at the end of just be like a tree and just grow. Like it's
yeah,
so simple, but when you sit there and you really read it and you think about it, like for me, like it's I like that's what I really think is so powerful about it. And the title and the meaning and the mission behind it is the aspect of growth and then what that looks like for you. Because you mentioned this earlier, how it looks different for everybody at every stage in their life. It's not always going to be the same and it's not always going to stay the same. And, it might look different this season over here. But the fact that we can have these conversations and it's there, it's available, people can tap in whenever they want, whenever is best for them. And, they can, and gain tips and insight from these topics, I think is incredible. And I love it. And I just want to thank you for, of course, making the time to come out here on Master Your Mental and share, a little bit more about your story and dive deeper into these topics and talk about, what you started here, the Just Grow podcast, why you got into this, what the impact that it's had on you and listeners and everybody so far who's engaged with this, I think is so important because I always love featuring anyone out there who has anything to bring to the table relevant to mental health and mindset and how working on our mindset can improve our mental health and vice versa. So I love what you're doing. I'm so happy that I got to come out to the event and actually meet you and see the conversation live and be in the audience and really feel the energy and get that value that so many people are going to continue to get from these events and conversations. So Nick, I want to thank you for coming out here on the podcast, sharing a little bit more about what you're doing and all these things. It's been so great. Of course, I feel like I can talk to you forever. We can get into all these different topics and just dive deeper into all these rabbit holes, but that would probably have to be another episode and another episode. But yeah, so thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I always love, as I mentioned, love having these conversations. So thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, you guys, whether you are listening during the daytime or during the nighttime, I hope that you guys have a good rest of your day or a good rest of your night. And I'm going to end it on that note and say bye to you guys and bye to Nick. So bye guys and bye, Nick.
Bye. Oh.